Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome one and all. My name's Kyle Candy. I'm a policy analyst here at the Institute, and I'm so excited you decided to join us today for the latest edition of our Governing Principles webinar series. Special thanks to today's panelists, New Mexico Lieutenant Governor Howie Morales, the Mayor of Patterson, New Jersey, Mr. Andre Saya, the Executive Director for the Center of Child Care Employment, Dr. Leah Austin, and our moderator, Dr. Ioma Ruka, the founding director of Equity East Research Action Coalition with the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before we get started, I wanted to start with a few logistical notes. We'll be keeping everyone on mute throughout, but we would love to hear from you. We have a couple ways you can do that. A significant portion of our conversation today will be dedicated to answering your questions. So please be sure to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions today as possible. We also welcome you to join, to tweet throughout. Whether you have questions or comments, please use the hashtag GovPrinciples. Our team will be live tweeting throughout the conversations, so we hope that you'll be able to join in on the discussion there as well. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Hunt Institute's President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, to open up the webinar. Over to you, Javed.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks to you and Lucy for your good work in assembling this dynamic panel. I'm excited about the number of participants we have registered, and I see the number that have already joined us. Hopeful that that audience will continue to grow. We're obviously with Facebook, we're on Facebook Live as well. Also thankful, you mentioned both Governor Morales and Mayor Sae, both are Hunt Cain Leadership Fellows, so really appreciate that they're continuing their partnership. Looking forward to seeing you two in person as we continue, hopefully, the great progress that's being made with this vaccination, and looking forward to seeing you in August. But across all of our work in education policy, we've seen the important role of bipartisan discussions around critical issues facing education. We're looking forward to hearing the perspectives of all of our leaders this afternoon. The importance of high quality early childhood education experiences set children up for future success has been proven time and time again. The pandemic, however, further highlighted the necessity of early childhood education as centers across the country rapidly began closing, leaving parents like myself scrambling, looking for places to help support our working families. Unfortunately, early childhood educators face poverty level wages, poor working conditions, lack of access to professional development, career growth, largely not being implemented a degree or certification requirement to enter the childhood workforce, which is contributing to the perception, this idea of early childhood being unprofessional, field for unprofessional, and limiting opportunities for growth. Most concerning for me is when we consider the early childhood workforce, 40% of women of color, they're disproportionately represented in the lowest paying jobs. So we're so fortunate to have this exceptional panel to discuss how we can recruit, how we can retain a high quality workforce while breaking down barriers to success for educators of color. Dr. Ruka, we're delighted to have you serve as our moderator today. I appreciate your continued partnership with our organization. I know that the heels are no longer in the tournament, but the real heels are in March Madness. So we're hopeful this will be a March Madness, and UNC Chapel Hill will represent well with you serving as our moderator today. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Siddiqui. Such a pleasure to be here with you and the rest of the team and your leadership in this space of governing principles and just supporting the early education community. So as Kyle noted earlier, I am the founder director of a new program area at UNC called Equity Research Action Coalition at UNC Frank Porter Graham. And really is focused on aligning early childhood research program policy through an anti-racist, anti-bias, culturally grounded approaches, especially for children of color and those who support, teach, and care for them. So it is my absolute honor and pleasure to moderate this esteemed panel that's really focused on recruiting, developing, and retaining the early child workforce. And I will also stress and also recruit and retaining a diverse workforce at all levels of the early kid education pipeline. So though there are hopeful signs that we are closer to being able to gather in person, I want to still remind us that we are still in the midst of a global pandemic that has challenged the early kid education system, a system that was already operating on very thin margins prior to the pandemic. Early in the pandemic, a report from the Center for American Progress and the National Association for the Education of Young Children estimated that we could lose up to 50% of the early care education programs. I don't know what the full number is, but hopefully Dr. Austin can tell us where we are in terms of teacher shortage, and as well as program shortages potentially. So we have had a shortage in high turnover rates of educators, early care education, and the pandemic just exposed this gulf even more, especially when you think about the issues of low pay, racial disparities based on settings and age group, and just the lack of benefits, including health and retirement, to just identify a couple of areas of inequities. So a coalition of national experts and organizations that I was a part of really discussed some of the challenges and potential national and state policy solutions. And I'll start with equity policy report. This to me is not just about an early care education crisis, but really a public health crisis, because we know the importance of our early childhood educators who are critical in the development of our children's health, learning, and identity, especially during the sensitive period of development. So while I have raised some of the challenges, as well as Dr. Siddiqui, in recruiting, developing, and retaining a high quality, diverse workforce, I do want to acknowledge the many organizations and institutions that are working on this issue. For example, we have a 2020 report from Trust of Learning entitled How Ideal Learning Approaches Prepare and Support Early Child Educators. And it really provides to me some powerful examples and recommendations, such as how do we recognize in-service competency-based training for state requirements? Or how about considering the creation of a national network and mentoring programs for pre-service teachers, right? In another report released just this past January and authored by the National Head Start Association in partnership with Bellwether Education Partners, entitled Broader, Deeper, and Fairer, they also provide 5 strategies, from redefining credentials, creating a super university for early childhood professionals, to create new opportunities for early educators to advance in their career while remaining in the classroom. So all is not lost. So I think between all the different reports about how to recruit, develop, and retain high quality early child educators, we do have some things out there. But really this conversation with Lieutenant Governor Morales, Mayor Seiya, as well as Dr. Austin should help to continue to push us further in finding solutions to this really a challenge that we have in our early care education workforce. So now it is time to hear from each of our special guests about what they are thinking about and working on regarding recruiting, developing, and retaining an early childhood workforce. So first, I will turn to Lieutenant Governor Morales to provide some opening remarks.
Thank you so much for the invitation. You know, we're fresh out of this year's legislative session. So I just got in from the state capitol to my home in southern New Mexico. And so it's good to be home, but a lot of work that has taken place and a lot of work that is continually going to be taking place. And I'm so grateful for Javed always including me on these wonderful discussions, and for the panel who are here, who are passionate about early childhood education. You know, in New Mexico, we've had a long struggle of trying to make sure that we can have the resources available to ensure that we're doing all that we can for all of our earliest learners. This is something that was very meaningful and special to me, simply because I served in the state Senate before I was in this role of Lieutenant Governor. And in the state Senate, working on the Finance Committee, we saw that there was a significant amount of dollars that were being appropriated to K-12 system, a lesser amount, but still significant to the higher ed system, and less than 1% of our budget was appropriated to early childhood education programs. I always remember as a state legislator when we hit the recession that I never wanted to pit one against the other, meaning K-12, higher ed, and early childhood education, recognizing that we were all in this together. But with the work and the leadership of Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and the legislature, we've seen significant improvement in not only funding for early childhood education, but also making sure that we recognize that we cannot reach the children. We cannot keep them safe, and we cannot educate them if it's not for those professionals who are out there on a daily basis providing the service. And I want to really highlight the word professionals, because that's exactly what our early childhood educators are. They're professionals. And all too often, it seemed in society for many years, they were thought of glorified babysitters, or that they were there just doing mildly easy work, when in reality, it's challenging, it's rewarding, but at the same time, it's at the professional level. And it's important that we as a state of New Mexico do all we can to recognize that. So our Secretary of Education, Elizabeth Gruginski, has done a tremendous job to bring us a global perspective of how we can work on that. It wasn't until a couple of years ago that the state moved into a direction and legislation that I was proud to carry as a state senator, and then to see it cross the finish line as lieutenant governor, was we created our Department of Early Learning. And we had focus on K-12. We have a public education department, and we had a higher education department. But we didn't have a department at the most critical stages of a child's life. Now, under our administration, we're proud to see that. And the amount of work that's taken place has been instrumental. When we look and see on the budgets and treating our professionals as true professionals, the wage supplement has just grown. Our budget has grown from where it was at amount. We've now doubled that coming into this next fiscal year. I think that's tremendous work. Our wage supplement increase is now providing scholarships to assist those professionals, not only to get the assistance that they need on a daily basis, but also a pathway for further education and further opportunities for their own selves to maybe one day be business owners, maybe one day to accelerate into other areas of the higher ed spectrum. And that's really key when I point out about higher ed, because you cannot have a developed workforce and a trained workforce if you don't have a consistent approach with your higher education system. And I see this last legislative session that we've made that a reality. And it's key because we want to continue to grow our own, to make sure that as we put more professionals into the system, that we're not only training them to go on to maybe the K-12 system or another system, but we're training them to stay within that early childhood area if they so choose to do so. So that's been continual support, and I'm grateful the professional development that's going to continue. You know, in New Mexico, in this last legislative session, we're going to have in front of our voters something that we've worked on for over a decade, and that is tapping into what we call our land grant permanent fund. In our land grant permanent fund, we have about $22 billion in there at this time. And we know that when we recognize that we've struggled for many years with quality of child well-being, well-roundedness and safety for our children, we've seen that through this legislative session that we just got out of, we just passed that to tap into 1% on a yearly basis of that $22 billion that will go directly to workforce development, to early childhood education programs. And I'm confident that when we come in front of the voters and ask them to allow us to do that, that's going to be done. And so we're grateful again for the work that's being done across the country, because something that's done in another state also has an impact on what we do in New Mexico. So it's recognizing, and even more so in this pandemic, that we are all in this together, that what impacts one in a positive way impacts us all in a positive way. So keep spreading that positivity, keep spreading that passion for early childhood education, and keep producing the results, because we're seeing a real change in this country. And we're grateful to be part of that here in the state of New Mexico.
Thank you for sharing such, first reminding us about the professionalization of professionals we work with, but also showing them the money, right? Trying to be able to support their economic development, but also their professional development. So thank you for just giving us some examples of the wonderful things happening in the state of Mexico. Thank you. So Mayor Sayo, I want to bring you into this conversation. Excuse me, Mayor Sayo. Please tell us, what would you like to share in terms of what's happening in your city?
Thank you, Dr. Ruka. And I'm going to speak not only as a perspective of a public servant, but as a parent. So I'm a proud father of 3. And quite frankly, it has been quite a struggle. But Patterson has a unique story. Back in 1998, we were one of 31 districts that won state-funded universal preschool for 3- and 4-year-olds in residence. And we're proud of the fact that we have a unique story. When I was a councilman, we had an issue. It was a quality of life problem with a notorious nightclub that was nestled in a working class neighborhood. And I can't begin to tell you some of the violations that were emanating from that den of iniquity. But ultimately, after a 4-year fight, we closed the doors down of that nightclub and we opened up a preschool. And it was in an underserved area. Patterson has a sizable Muslim population. And in the past, like I stated, parents in that community were not very forthcoming as far as wanting to send their children to preschool. So once we closed the doors down, we opened up the doors to a preschool in an area that was underserved. And the preschool is owned and operated by a Patterson resident, African-American woman named Dr. Brenda Belmont. And in order to accommodate the children in that neighborhood, she hired an Arabic-speaking director for the preschool who has been able to connect with parents and children alike. But we built on that because we saw that once Muslim parents were at ease with sending their children to preschool, she opened up a second site not too far from that site. And now she's running 3 preschools in Paterson, whereas at one point we didn't have any that she was operating. So she built on that success, and that's something that we're really proud of, because one, like I stated before, is in a working class neighborhood. The other is not too far from it, and then the other was closer to the center of town. And what she did was she prioritized hiring highly qualified teachers that hailed from the city of Paterson, because we always say we want our teachers to reflect the students that they are teaching. And quite frankly, we want to empower Pattersonians. So she has a pipeline all these years, recruiting from local community colleges and colleges, because there are requirements based on that 1998 designation of Paterson being in that district that was going to receive the state funding to have universal preschool. So the teachers also have to have a bachelor's degree. They have to do 60 hours of professional development over the course of 3 years. And the maximum class size is 15. So here we are, we have, in one school alone, she has about 5 classrooms with 15 students, and then she built on that. That is a story that we like to tell in our city as far as preschool success is concerned. And quite frankly, we want to continue to expand. She has plans for a 4th site as well, but it couldn't be made possible without the state's investment. New Jersey has prioritized early childhood and said that that is definitely an investment that will pay dividends for our society, because quite frankly, these early childhood centers, these preschools, are promoting the path from pre-K ultimately to college, if those children so desire to pursue something in higher education. But like I stated before, in Paterson, we have prioritized preschools, and with that notorious nightclub, we turned it around and turned it into something very positive. And now you have about 75 young people, 3 and 4-year-olds, that are getting a high quality early childhood education. And again, I want to just circle back. As a parent, I can speak from experience because my children were beneficiaries.
Well, thank you for that, Mayor. And I would say, yes, as a mother of a 4 and a 7-year-old, I mean, if we cannot appreciate our early education professionals, I did before, but I definitely do so. And I only have 2 and not 15. So thank you for just sharing sort of the history, right, that really, came about from a lawsuit to where you guys are in the city, but also in the state, as again, another example of how states could really enhance and increase diversity and equity within the workforce and have it reach locally. So thank you for sharing sort of that history and where you guys are now. So now I turn it to, obviously, Dr. Austin to sort of talk with us just in terms of sort of the center, what you guys are doing in terms of where you're finding about the workforce, and share with us your knowledge. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to join this panel where we can devote this much needed attention to the early childhood workforce. So I want to start by asking folks to think about how much is it you think early educators in your state are paid? Were we in a room together, I would ask folks to call out your answers, but I'm guessing there would be a range. The reality is that the national median wage for those classified as childcare workers is just $11.65 an hour. And it's as low as $8.94 in Mississippi, and only as high as $15.36 in Washington, D.C. And for those who are identified as preschool teachers, and let me just say, we were talking about early childhood and kind of from infancy through preschool, and thinking of people as preschool teachers or childcare workers, it's really a false dichotomy. They're not doing different things, but these are data categories we have from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so it's what we have to deal with. But those who are identified in that category as preschool teachers are only faring slightly better, with a national median wage of $14.67. So in the 3rd edition of our Early Childhood Workforce Index that we released a month ago, we document this information for every state. We also report for every state the consequences of these low wages. Poverty rates for our early educators are incredibly high. On average, they're 8 times higher than that of K-8 teachers. It ranges from about 11% in Virginia to 34% in Florida. And in no state does the median wage of childcare workers meet the living wage standard for one adult with just 1 child. So when we think about this in the big picture, it's certainly important to identify accessible pathways to education, training, and into a variety of early childhood jobs. but alone is not sufficient. And we've heard that already today as we think about the compensation and working conditions and how important that is. And we know that nearly 2/3 of those who are working in childcare centers and 1/3 of those who are working in home-based childcare programs already have college degrees. And among those without degrees, most have participated in some type of higher education or training. Yet their working conditions and their wages have largely remained unchanged for decades, even as increases in requirements and qualifications have gone up. And this really does reflect the historic undervaluing of work that's performed by women and by people of color. You know, we have a quality workforce. We have nearly 2 million people who are paid to provide early care and education services across the country, but we don't have our quality conditions that support them to thrive. And of course, COVID has only worsened the outlook for this sector, as you've already mentioned. You know, while schools and other businesses closed, childcare for the most part was expected to remain open, and typically without being provided much needed resources to do things like purchase and access PPE and cleaning supplies, or to stabilize their programs due to reduced enrollment or requirements to operate smaller programs. Only a few states, and New Mexico is one of them, provided extra pay for workers who are working in these conditions, and continue to do so, as you reminded us that we are still in the middle of this health crisis. And what we see as a result of COVID is that nearly 200,000 early childhood jobs have been lost since the onset of the pandemic. And so we have to be really concerned, of course, about how we're going to fill those positions as we move forward, but also how to retain people in their jobs given the conditions. But I will say it's not all bad news, and we see some great examples of this in Patterson and in New Mexico. And this can be fixed. The low wages and inadequate workforce policies that are widespread today are a result of policy choices, and policies can change. And again, we see evidence of this in the two communities we've already heard about today. So I'm really eager for us to hear more and to dig into this discussion and identify ways for us to move forward and ensure we're supporting our early care and education workforce appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. Can you remind me, what was the number? I want to make sure we underscore it. What was the number of jobs you've lost so far? You said 2,000?
Nearly 200,000.
200,000. So I think that's an important number to, and that's an important number that we have to remember and underscore. So I'm going to turn to you. I'm going to ask a couple of opening questions to each of our esteemed panelists. So Lieutenant Governor Morales, in addition to establishing a New Mexico Early Child Education and Care Department, New Mexico also works to create the Early Childhood Trust Fund to create what you already described sort of as this long-term investment strategy for earlier in the state. So through this investment in the early child department, how is the state thinking about addressing the workforce needs? Again, I kind of go back to Dr. Austin's, like 200,000 jobs lost. This is nationally, not knowing what it is for New Mexico specifically, but can you tell us, how is the state thinking about this workforce needs, especially with sort of this new creation of a long-term investment plan?
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to the discussion that it does go hand in hand with the collaboration between our higher education system and our early childhood education opportunities there. So when we see such a big investment that's been done within our budget, you have to make sure that there's a plan in place. One of the arguments of increasing that budget was the thought that we don't have the infrastructure in place that would be able to provide these programs. But of course, with the trust fund that was passed, and then now with the land grant permanent fund possibility of being tapped in, that has to be the continual focus, is making sure that those dollars are going directly to workforce development. Again, as was mentioned by Dr. Austin, not just to recruit, but also to retain. So what we've seen right there is that we've seen that a $2.6 million investment just on the higher education program development fund is significant. And it may not seem like that much in other states, but New Mexico is a smaller state, and our budget, overall budget, is $7 billion. So there's that amount of focus that's right there. So again, the scholarship piece, we're adding 2,000 scholarships for our workforce, making sure that the training and the support is there, and then providing the pay parity. And I think this is absolutely key. When you talk about pay parity, we're looking at 300 community-based pre-K educators who will benefit from that. and that pay parity aspect of it. Because again, we want to make sure not only do we have that some coming in right out of the university setting or right out of the workforce setting, but that we can also train them and develop them. So those are just a couple examples of how New Mexico plans on utilizing these funds that are now going to make their way to the system.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Lieutenant Governor Morales. So Mayor Saya, as you mentioned in the opening remarks, in your time as mayor, you have worked to expand access to childcare in Patterson. So when expanding these opportunities, how are you and other local partners working to ensure that there are enough qualified early child educators to meet the needs of the community? What advice would you have for other local leaders as they're seeking to expand access in their communities, but really still have questions about staffing these new facilities, especially in light of obviously the global pandemic and sort of maybe a bit of the eroding of the early education workforce? Any advice you can provide there?
So in addition to having these highly qualified teachers with these bachelor's degrees in the classrooms, we also have paraprofessionals who are in the classrooms as well. And these are low-income individuals who ultimately would like to be teachers. So they're teachers in training. So we want to afford them an opportunity and put them on the path to be permanent teachers. And we have a cohort in William Patterson University that's assisting as well. And then we clearly want to let them know that they are valued and we want to keep them in the classroom. And keeping them in the classroom is the operative word, because in Passaic County, Patterson is the seat of Passaic County. We have what's called Civitas strategies, and they have been working in Patterson, and they've helped child care providers stay alive with PPP. So in 2020, it was about $2.4 million. And now in 2021, it'll be about $5 million. So we have to keep the doors open, and we're very grateful because now we're meeting the caregivers where they are in the language and using the record systems as well. But it's important to keep these doors open, and we're proud that that PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, is benefiting these centers.
Thank you for that, Mayor. So Dr. Austin, so the Workforce Index includes 7 policy areas to improve early childhood educator jobs. What do you see as low-hanging fruit that state and local policymakers can focus on that can immediately improve their early childhood workforce? Which I know could be hard, but yes.
Yes, I mean, this is such a challenging question when I thought about this, because the reality is like there's no low-hanging fruit. And by that, I mean, there's not something that can be obtained with little effort when it comes to the early career and education workforce in this country, given the current conditions. However, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done. It just means that there's not that single ingredient that we're looking for. I think when we think about the most immediate situation and being in the middle of this pandemic, I think there are basic provisions that remain urgent, making sure that educators have access to PPE and sanitizing supplies, just the basic things, equipment and supplies that people need to protect themselves in their programs, ensuring that early educators have access to free COVID testing and that they're prioritized for vaccines. And so part of that means ensuring that outreach is happening to communities, it's happening in multiple languages, it's happening across states and local communities, guaranteeing paid sick leave if early educators must quarantine or they become sick from COVID. We know that there are estimates that, as many as 20% of people in this workforce are working without health insurance and health coverage, and guaranteeing health coverage if people have to leave or if they get sick, if their family members get sick. Again, I believe New Mexico is the only state that has ensured that childcare workers have health coverage working during this pandemic. So I think those sort of things are immediate and really critical. I would encourage folks to check out the Early Childhood Workforce Index and familiarize yourself with the earnings and economic conditions of early educators in your state if you're not already familiar with that, as well as the status along these workforce policy areas that are really critical and ways to move forward. And that includes qualifications and educational supports, the working conditions, compensation, workforce data, and financing. And among those, I think there are a couple things that are maybe somewhat easier than others to start moving forward on. Prioritizing workforce data collection is something that can be complicated, certainly in states, but is not a terribly large lift. Most states, though, are not routinely collecting critical data about the early care and education workforce on a regular basis. Who makes up your workforce? What are people paid? You know, do you know the gap, for example, between where people are now and to get to pay parity, as Lieutenant Governor Morales is mentioning in New Mexico? What does that look like in your state? How much do you need to invest? What levels of education do people already have? And how does that vary? Are there disparities within your workforce? So for example, we've identified evidence of racial wage gaps at the national level and communities where we do have some data available. So really understanding and knowing what that looks like in your community, I think is really incredibly important. And then of course, I would be remiss if I didn't address the American Rescue Plan. Stabilization funding is allowing childcare programs to address personnel, which includes resources for recruitment and retention. So this is a real opportunity for states to put forward guidelines to provide financial support directly to staff and programs, thinking about, you know, how to use wage augmentations or retention allowances, stipends, these sorts of things that could be available. So there's no one easy thing, but with intention, states can really, and local communities can really begin to make headway now.
Thank you for that, Dr. Austin. And I think for elevating that, you can't fix what you don't collect or what you don't know. And so I thank you, I appreciate you for bringing that up. So I'd like to kind of offer a follow-up question for all of the panelists. So recognizing the cost of early care education is already a burden for families. There's often an expressed concern that increasing educator compensation and required qualification will raise childcare costs even higher. How can policymakers and providers work to balance these needs? So any one of you can respond to this question.
I'm happy to jump in here. I mean, so I guess I would say there has to be an increase of public dollars to address this, right? Families simply cannot afford to cover the true cost of care. And when they're expected to, or when public resources are too low, the results are that services end up being subsidized on the back of the educators with the low wages that are paid to them. And parents, mostly mothers, are the ones who are having to drop out of the workforce or reduce their hours because they don't have access to adequate childcare. And so I think, you know, again, there's no easy solution. It really does take public investment to ensure parents are not overburdened. They can't afford this to begin with. And we have a situation now where most childcare in this country is, you know, dependent on what parents can pay, what they can afford, and that is directly linked to the wages of people in the program. And so we have to break that link between, you know, parent pay and teacher, what teachers earn, and really come up with a public solution and public investment to have a system that's effective and equitable for children and their families, and the providers and staff and programs as well.
And if I may,
Thank you for that.
Dr. Ruha,
Oh, please go ahead.
on what Dr. Austin was saying, I think it's a matter of marrying vision with value. So as policymakers, clearly our vision has to be driven on what we see long-term for our young men and women who are entering these childcare centers, these preschools. And then the value, how much do we value it? And New Jersey, like I stated before, in 1998, they showed how much they value by selecting 31 districts, Patterson including, saying, look, we'll fund it and it'll be universal program. But I mean, there was 31 that selected. There's about 616 school districts in New Jersey. So I know that in neighboring towns, the drive is for universal childcare, state funded. So we got to get to that point where no one has to make that difficult decision, and that we prove to the people that put us in these positions that we have a vision and we value early childhood education.
And I
you,
appreciate
Mayor.
that too. And just wanted to point out that it's exactly right, is having the investment that's in place. You know, oftentimes the thought is that what is it going to cost us? And the reality of it is, what does it cost us if we don't invest in these type of approaches and don't invest in the people who are providing the services? And rather than a mindset that says that we're passing the burden that would be passed on to families and to parents, instead, as a state, we've chosen to invest heavily so that way we're celebrating the investment together and recognizing building it from the inside out, to have those approaches of making sure that we're providing the dollar investments. And not to forget, and I think it's an important point to bring out, there was many dollars that came in through our CARES Act, through the federal funding that was available, and to utilize that as a leveraging point of to recognize how we can continue to grow our economy and to continue to grow our investment. We recognize that although that may be a one-time non-recurring infusion of dollars coming in, we can utilize that to do it in a comprehensive way that's going to ensure that the investment remains long beyond the federal support has been there.
Thank you for that, Lieutenant Governor Morales. Can you say a little bit more just in terms of, obviously, we know that federal support can really play a really significant role in closing the funding gap for states looking to support early education. So are you able to talk about how your state is using the American Recovery Act funds or even the Child Care Development Block Grant funds to support efforts to strengthen the workforce, either traditional or even one-time pandemic relief? Anything you can kind of give insight on regarding how you're using some of those federal funds?
Absolutely. And I think that is an important point as we talk about how we use those dollars, recognizing that they're not going to be recurring, but what we can do to get the most out of it. Train the trainer type of approaches, doing what we can to diversify our professionals who are there, because we live in New Mexico where we have many tribal communities, many in the colonias areas also, that we can extend out and we can help to develop more of our workforce in those areas. Because as the mayor mentioned, is that you always want to make sure that you can have those students and those children benefiting, see a reflection of themselves, of those who are providing the services. So having those CARES Act money and the infusion of dollars coming in, it's important that we make sure that we're investing it properly to make sure that it's not only going to have that impact now, but also going to allow us to train and to continue to further develop that workforce for years to come.
Dr. Ruka.
Thank you. Go ahead. Oh, please go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah, please pardon the interruption. So I want to dovetail on what the Lieutenant Governor just stated as far as the CARES Act is concerned, because our public schools have been closed since last March. So March 16th of 2020, they've been closed. And in the second round of CARES Act funding, our city received a little over $5 million. We earmarked about $3.8 million to the school districts. So we said, well, look, we want them to safely reopen every school, irrespective of whether it was a preschool or if it was K through 12. So they're purchasing Promethean boards, they're purchasing PPE. We have the thermal cameras. When people walk in, they can take your temperature, because we feel like now is the time to get the kids back into school and the teachers back into school, but we want to do it safely. And that's why we're allowed to earmark a significant amount of CARES Act money for that purpose.
And that speaks to probably the work you and others do. So with you, Mayor, still, sticking with you, we see that strong partnerships are a critical tool in the toolbox of local government. How can city or county governments partner with other stakeholders to support efforts to build and retain the early childhood workforce, especially when we do have a loss in workforce? Like what is some advice you can give to other local
and I'm glad
leaders?
that I talked about the CARES Act money, right? Because that does indirectly help. Well, no, it directly helps get people back to school and keep people in work. So, and that was definitely a partnership between the Patterson Public Schools, the city of Patterson, and the county of Passaic, securing federal dollars for that. So going forward, if there are other funding opportunities, because now for the first time in a long time, we have a grant writer here in the city of Patterson, we can help identify anything that could potentially help as far as a cross-boundary collaboration is concerned with the county, with the school district, and with the city.
Shoot, those little resources like a grant writer. Hello, thank you for lifting that up, Mayor.
Thank you.
Dr. Austin, you're welcome. Dr. Austin, our next question comes from Natalie Danner. She's been hearing from many child care center directors that they are unable to find qualified teachers. They want a reduction in qualification so they can stay open but reducing teacher qualifications reduces the quality of early child education. So how can we keep centers open, pay early child educators a professional, equitable salary, and keep qualifications connected to quality? That's a whole mouthful that Natalie Danner put it there, but really important and really a question. So if you have any, I have thoughts, of course, but please, Dr. Austin, can you share what you're thinking?
Yes, there's a lot in that question, but I think, this really speaks to, again, the need for comprehensive public investment. And because there's so few resources in the system right now, we have this situation where like all sorts of groups are like, I don't know if they pitted against each other, but in many ways they are, right? That if without public investment and enough money in the resource into programs and resources, parents have to shoulder the burden. Programs can't come up with more money, right, from parents or elsewhere. And so we end up with unfunded mandates, right, which is not what we want to do. Like, yes, we want to ensure that our workforce is, well prepared, trained, has appropriate working conditions, and has appropriate pay. But it is unreasonable to expect, programs for the most part to be able to afford, the same wages as K-8 schools or K-12 schools, right? If we, treat it the K-12 system, which has its own, that's a whole other conversation about what improvements need to be made there. But if we designed our K-12 system the way our early childhood system is, it wouldn't exist. It simply would not be affordable, right? And the system would be in complete shambles. But that's what we've done, and we expect somehow programs to magically come up with the resources to be able to appropriately fund programs and pay wages. And again, it's just the math doesn't work, right? So we really have to have public investment. And I think, there are some models. Again, I'll point to New Mexico. There's great things happening in New Mexico, lots of good examples. In North Carolina is another state that comes to mind, where there are groups of center directors, parents, and teachers, and providers, family childcare providers, who are really working in coalition with each other to advocate for new policies, to advocate for resources, getting on the same page and saying, yes, we all think this is important, and we're all going to push back if it's an unfunded mandate. And we're going to demand together that these resources come into our programs. And so I think looking at those models of how to develop those coalitions so everybody can be advocating for the same thing without feeling like that burden's going to fall on me and my program or my family is critical. And those alliances are really essential rather than these demands and expectations really tearing people apart in some communities, which just undermines what we're trying to accomplish, but is really I think understandable when we see the lack of resources.
Thank you. And I want to just, thank you for really the idea. We need a comprehensive funding model. And I think to Maya Sayad's earlier comment about we have to have a vision. We also have to have a will, right? Like you can't say to somebody, hey, low qualifications so that during the most sensitive period of brain development and children's development that we have lower quality staff, but also knowing that we cannot demand more if you don't pay more, right? So we have to sort of figure out where is our vision and where is our will, and pay people what they are worth, because this is the most important time. So I wonder if the mayor wants to say more, if Lieutenant Governor Morales wants to say more, please.
Actually, thanks, Doctor. I wanted to discuss, since we were talking about PPE and trying to help these schools safely reopen, I want to talk about also vaccinating the teachers, which has become a priority, right? So our school district partnered with 2 local hospitals. We've been vaccinating not just teachers, but staff as well, so that we can get them back into the classrooms. Because a major concern I mentioned, we haven't been in session since March 16th of 2020, is learning loss. How do you make up for that? What do you do to accommodate for what was lost as far as the schooling is concerned, or education is concerned? And there's been talk that they may go back in May, but does that mean it's only May and June? Do they extend it to July and then just give everyone off in August and you go into September? So that's something that we've been grappling with, but we have to vaccinate the staff in the schools so that we can get back. I mean, we've been providing them with all the equipment and some of the other materials that they need, but the vaccination is a priority for us.
Yes.
And I
Lieutenant Governor?
Yeah, I just want to point out again, is I think it's great that the discussion is taking place, especially around the alignment of systems. I can't stress that enough about having each system working in collaboration rather than isolation. And I give you an example in New Mexico, long before the discussions came up as far as college tuition being paid for, New Mexico had passed groundbreaking legislation that basically is we call the lottery scholarship. And every high school senior that graduates from a New Mexico high school can go on and get their university in a New Mexico university system, get their tuition paid for. And I think that's been great. Obviously, that we've been extremely happy with the way that's gone, and we've had to make adjustments. But when we had that much of an investment that was done for those high school seniors going on to the college area, the piece in the system alignment is so critical now as I share more funding coming into early childhood education. The problem is that when we can invest so much into going into the college setting, if we didn't invest and we don't invest at the early childhood stages, we're going to have kids who are never going to have the opportunity at the high school senior level or at the college level to take advantage of some of those investments that have been made, for example, on tuition scholarships. So I can't stress enough the importance of having the alignment to make sure that all of our systems, early childhood education, K-12 and our higher education system, even our adult basic education programs are all in alignment, because it comes down to a developed, well-trained and educated population within the state.
Thank you for that. And you see me taking notes because there's so much richness in this conversation that I want to make sure I have notes when I decide to refer back to all the wonderful ideas and suggestions that you've been sharing. So the next question we have, go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah, I was going to say,
please, jump in.
Government can play a role, school district can play a role, but you also need nonprofit organizations, you need private foundations who see how significant this investment can be and how we need to be aligned. So in Patterson, we're very fortunate. We have the Henry and Marilyn Taub Foundation, and they've prioritized early childhood education. And I can't tell you what we would have not been able to accomplish without their investment. And quite frankly, without them really pouring everything that they have into our school district. So I do want to make it abundantly clear. It's not just municipal government. It's not just county government, state government, federal government. It's also private foundations that can play a role as well.
That's right. Thank you. So this is go ahead, Dr. Austin.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that. I mean, I think there is a really important role when we think about philanthropy for supporting advocacy, supporting organizing. I know some funders are already doing that and very interested, and some are still more shy about direct kind of advocacy and organizing support. And I think that's a really important role to play to help build some of that on the ground support and alignment that we need to advocate for broader policies, greater investment, and to support, with narrative change and helping to communicate these really critical ideas, across communities. And those are things we don't always think about, how important investment in those aspects of kind of laying the groundwork or planting the seeds are.
Yeah. I do want to get this question in here from Oscar Tang. I think it's really an important one. So Oscar Tang is a home-based childcare provider and asked about support for early childhood centers based in family homes. So as we know, particularly, children and families of color and including those with infants and toddlers often choose programs home-based programs due to their feelings that their culture and priorities are more likely to be considered. So how do we ensure that home-based providers and educators receive state, local support around professional development, continuing education, certification, and even wage supplements and these other economic support? So any thoughts about how we can really begin to also think about the home-based providers and also the infant toddler providers as well? Anybody can start.
I can jump in here.
You know, Lieutenant Governor, I always say ladies first.
I think that we absolutely have to be thinking about family childcare, home-based childcare providers are a critical part of the system. And in our work at the center, when we think about the early childhood workforce, we think about those working with children from infancy, again through preschool, across those settings, in home-based settings and in center-based settings. And there are some needs that are similar, and there are some, of course, needs that are really unique. But early childhood educators, regardless of where they're working, require supportive working conditions, and they require appropriate pay, fair pay that helps people, earn a living, right? And not be worrying about economic stress and feeding their own families. And so when we think about our policies and investments, family childcare providers have to be a part of that. And really, there's no reason not to. There's no reason that when we think about, contracts and resources and money going into centers, family childcare can operate the same way in terms of having those relationships with public entities and public and with governments to receive funding, to ensure that there's enough resources going into those programs to support wages of the women who are operating, and men and women who are operating these businesses, as well as staff that they may have. In this crisis, we have seen family childcare be more likely to stay open than centers. And when we examine why that is, it's because it seems like it's because of the financial precarity with that family childcare is operating with. There are fewer resources going in to those programs, greater levels of economic insecurity. And I think that's a real opportunity for us to look at this and say, how do we ensure, what can we do to make sure that this workforce and those programs are part of our systems? Again, I would assume, in New Mexico and in other states that are doing scholarships and wage supplements, that they're finding ways to include family childcare in those. There's really nothing, right, other than people's perspectives and assumptions about centers and family childcare and what one is doing and one isn't, that would preclude that investment and involvement. So it's, again, really about challenging those perceptions and saying, like, this is a critical part of this infrastructure that has to be included.
Mayor, Lieutenant Governor, any response to the home-based question?
And when we did pass the legislation that moved forward with us having a department that was going to be focused specifically on early childhood education and programming, one of the central discussions that happened was to make sure that we didn't create winners and losers, meaning from the public side that you were going to have those that benefited from it, and then we were going to be putting small businesses, home-based providers out, without any support. And I think there was a good compromise that had taken place, and to recognize the importance of supporting all the systems that we could as much as possible. And I think that we're seeing that, but I also want to just recognize the importance of rewarding and to incentivize quality too, because when we want to have many of these services available, we also want to make sure that the quality aspect is there, and to recognize the key component of providing that quality workforce is so critical to make sure that we can provide that support there. I often hear that at times you try to attract, and it is a recruiting type of effort in any field that you're in. But many times it was always thought of that you try to attract into the public school systems or the higher ed systems, leaving the thought that at the early childhood stages that it was somewhat of a stepping stone. And I don't think that's necessarily the discussion anymore. I think that we recognize the importance of early childhood providers and the professionals that they are. And as I had my opening remarks, I mentioned and stressed the fact that they are professionals and need to continue to be treated as professionals. And that's why I'm proud in our state. Just last week, we passed a paid sick leave piece of legislation that'll also extend that. because we can talk about the pay parity, we can talk about the scholarships and the wages, and I think all that is important. But we also have to recognize there's other ways, whether it's the home-based provider, the faith-based provider, in the public settings, that we're also providing the narrative that we value those who are doing the critical job of educating and taking their children to the next level of their academic and social well-being journey. So just want to recognize that it's not just on just the economics of it, but also the social well-being and the support for those professionals in that job.
Yeah, I'm Andre
Thank you.
Thea, and I approve that message.
Well, I was going to ask you, I know we literally have 3 minutes, which is really 1 minute. So if each of you can take 30 seconds, what would you say to a childcare provider educator who was in front of you? What would you tell them? So 30 seconds, no more than 30 seconds. I'm watching you.
Ladies first.
May I say it? Okay.
No, ladies
Dr.
first.
Austin. Okay, Dr. Austin.
I would tell the early childhood provider in front of me to get organized, get with their peers, and organize so that they can also be acting and having power on behalf of themselves.
Thank you. May I say it?
Yeah, so I would speak from the perspective of a parent. Quite frankly, I would speak to the value that we see in what they do and the vision that we have to get these children going on a journey we hope ends with a high-paying job and a career that they want to pursue. So quite frankly, I would tell that child care provider, I got your back.
Thank you. And Lieutenant Governor Morales.
And I would say my message is thank you. Thank you for the work that you've done, not just during this pandemic, but throughout the years of service that's been provided. You know, much of my work that I've done in the legislature and now in the administration of New Mexico has come from professionals on the ground, people who I've known. I can mention them that may not, recognize just the impact they've had. People like Dr. Shannon Rivera, Terry Anderson, Anita Rios, who are from my home local community, who taught me so much about early childhood education, to look at it from a different perspective than rather just the delivery of educational resources, but also just to recognize that it wasn't just an occupation or a job, but it was a ministry that these early childhood education providers are doing. And I just want to say thank you for providing that ministry to people across our state.
And thank you for each of you guys for sharing your time, your expertise, and so much more. So I will turn it back to Kyle. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ruka, and thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. Special thank you to our panelists, Lieutenant Governor Morales, Mayor Saya, and Dr. Austin for a fantastic conversation. You know, I really appreciate Dr. Austin's point earlier in the webinar. You know, these issues are rooted in policy choices, and we just have to make the choices to resolve them. We're sorry if we weren't able to get to all of your questions today. We had quite a few in the Q&A, but please feel free to tweet us using the hashtag #GovPrinciples, and we'll do our best to answer it. We're also working to put together a follow-up Twitter town hall with our panelists the next week or so. So be sure to follow us on Twitter if you haven't already, so you can engage with us again on this super important topic. We'll also post a recording of this webinar as well as a recap on our Hunt Institute blog in the next week. Check back for that and feel free to share with your networks once it's live. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our upcoming webinars, including a special early efforts webinar this Thursday focused on promoting equity within state child care systems. A registration link is going to be popped in that chat in just a moment. We sincerely hope you can register and join us on Thursday for another great conversation here. We have a few other upcoming webinars. You should see those on your screen now. We have a number of series span the education continuum, so we truly have something for everyone and hope to see you on Zoom again really soon. Finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll be brought to a survey page. We ask that you please share your thoughts with us so we can continue to make this series a success. Thanks so much to all of our panelists again. Hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you.